A band from Winnipeg, Canada, not Los Angeles, not New York, not London, Winnipeg, sells over 20 million records worldwide. They land a #1 album on the Billboard 200. They score a #1 single on the Billboard Hot 100. They headline arenas across North America and Europe. Their music becomes so deeply woven into the fabric of rock culture that decades later, you still hear it blasting from stadium speakers every single weekend. Then it all implodes. Lawsuits, accusations of unauthorized touring, brothers refusing to speak, legal battles over who even owns the name dragging on for years, decades, in fact. Members pointing fingers across courtrooms. A legacy at war with itself. One of the biggest Canadian rock acts of the 1970s went from filling arenas to fighting in court over a band name. This is the story of how success, the very thing they'd sacrificed everything to achieve, became the weapon that tore Bachman-Turner Overdrive apart from the inside out. But to understand the collapse, we have to go back to Winnipeg, 1973. Winnipeg, Manitoba in the early 1970s was not exactly the rock and roll capital of the world. It was cold, it was working class, and it was a long way from the glittering excess of the music industry. But sometimes the most explosive things come from the most unlikely places. Randy Bachman already had a rock pedigree before BTO ever played a single note. He'd been the lead guitarist and primary songwriter for the Guess Who, one of Canada's defining bands of the late 60s and early 70s. He'd helped write their biggest hits. He was the creative engine. But by 1973, Randy was done. Disagreements, personal tensions, a sense that the road forward wasn't the road he wanted to walk, and he was out. Most people, after leaving a band that's successful, might take a breath. Randy Bachman formed a new band almost immediately. He pulled together a lineup built on blood and trust. His brother Robbie Bachman on drums, his brother Tim Bachman on guitar, and Fred Turner, a hard-driving bassist with a voice like gravel and thunder, rounding out the group. The name came from a trucking magazine called Overdrive, slapped together with the Bachman name to create Bachman-Turner Overdrive. Hardworking, blue-collar, no frills. The name alone told you exactly what you were getting. Their sound matched the branding. No prog rock indulgence. No glam theatrics. Just hard, direct, guitar-driven rock and roll. Heavy riffs. Fred Turner's raw, gritty vocal delivery. Randy's instinct for a hook that burrowed into your skull and stayed there. This was music for people who punched in at a job and wanted something that moved when they turned up the volume. They signed to Mercury Records and released their debut album in 1973. It gained traction. Blue Collar found its way to radio. The working-class image they projected wasn't manufactured, it was genuine. And audiences could feel that. Tim Bachman left the band shortly after the debut. The first fracture, small but telling. He was replaced by Blair Thornton, who slid into lead guitar duties and tightened the lineup into the configuration that would conquer rock radio. But even in those earliest days, with the momentum just starting to build, something was already embedded in the foundation of this band that would one day become impossible to ignore. This was a family operation. Brothers. Blood. And when things get complicated in any band, money, credit, control, direction. Those tensions cut deeper when they run along family lines. The seeds were already there. Nobody saw them yet, but they were there. By the time 1973 was wrapping up, Bachman-Turner Overdrive had already released their debut. But it was their second album, Bachman-Turner Overdrive 2, that changed everything. It included a track called Takin Care of Business. You know the riff. You've heard it in grocery stores, at sporting events, in commercials, in movies. That guitar line is so deeply embedded in the cultural DNA of the 1970s that it almost feels like it was always there, like it was discovered rather than written. Takin Care of Business became one of the most played rock songs in history. Not just a hit, an institution. Beneath this triumph, though, something else was building quietly. The pressure of following up success. The expectations multiplying. The machinery of the music industry starting to gear up around them in ways that would become harder and harder to control. But in 1974, none of that mattered yet. Because 1974 was the year BTO reached the absolute top. Their third album, Not Fragile, hit #1 on the Billboard 200. Number 1. A Canadian hard rock band from Winnipeg at the top of the American charts. And it wasn't just the album. The single, You Ain't Seen Nothing Yet, reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Their biggest song, their defining moment, their cultural peak, and it was almost an accident. Randy Bachman has said in interviews that the song was originally written as a joke gift for his brother Gary, who had a stutter. Randy stuttered on the vocals playfully, never intending it for release. When the label heard it, they pushed for it to come out. Randy was reluctant. The public was not. The song went to #1 and became their signature. There's something almost painful about that story in retrospect. Their biggest hit, the song most people associate with them, wasn't meant to be theirs at all. It was an afterthought, a joke, and yet it defined them forever. Roll On Down the Highway became another top 20 hit. By 1975, BTO was headlining arenas, multiple gold and platinum certifications. Over 20 million records sold worldwide. One of the best-selling Canadian rock acts of the decade. FM radio couldn't get enough of them. What fans didn't see, what no one saw from the outside, was the cost of that pace. They were touring constantly, relentlessly. North America and Europe, city after city, venue after venue. The demands of being the sound of the moment in mid-70s rock radio meant you couldn't slow down, because the moment you slowed down, something else filled the space. The music industry doesn't pause. 5 studio albums between 1973 and 1977. Think about that. 5 albums in 4 years, plus the touring. The pressure was immense, and the structure holding everything together, family, shared history, a handshake understanding of who did what, was being tested in ways nobody wanted to acknowledge. And that's where the trouble began. By 1975, Bachman-Turner Overdrive was at the top of the rock world. Arenas packed. Radio dominance. A fan base that stretched across North America and Europe. They were the working man's rock band, and the working man loved them back. It was the moment they'd worked for. The moment everything was supposed to feel worth it. But that moment of glory was also the beginning of the end. Because while they looked unstoppable on stage, the internal structure of the band was starting to crack under the weight of everything they'd built. Randy Bachman had become the undeniable creative center, the songwriter, the guitarist, the face. That kind of gravitational imbalance creates resentment, even when nobody talks about it. Especially when nobody talks about it. Randy wanted to push the music in new directions. Experimentation. Evolution. The other members, comfortable with the formula that had made them rich and famous, were less interested in changing what was clearly working. Why fix what isn't broken? But Randy saw it differently. A band that doesn't grow stagnates. And a band built around one creative force, with the others holding that force in place rather than pushing alongside it. That's not a band. That's a tension waiting for a trigger. Later albums weren't matching the commercial heights of Not Fragile. The momentum was slowing. And as it slowed, every underlying disagreement became louder. Financial disputes started surfacing. In any successful band, money is the thing that turns friction into flame. Who was earning what? Who controlled what? Who had more leverage and who resented them for it? Add the complexity of family, of brothers, and you have a situation where business grievances become personal wounds that never fully heal. Touring fatigue was real. Morale was eroding. And the music world was changing around them. Punk was arriving, harsh and confrontational, making classic hard rock feel suddenly like yesterday's sound. Disco was pulling mainstream audiences in a completely different direction. The very cultural moment that had made BTO massive was shifting beneath their feet. In 1977, Randy Bachman left Bachman-Turner Overdrive. It wasn't a dramatic public implosion, no single catastrophic moment the cameras caught. It was the result of everything that had been building: creative disagreements, financial tensions, the slow erosion of the family bond that had made the band possible in the first place. Randy was done. He walked away from the band he'd built, the band that bore his name, the band that had made him one of the most recognizable guitarists in rock. Without Randy, the band tried to continue. They changed the name slightly, releasing material under variations of the BTO brand. But the creative core was gone. The songwriting engine, the guitar voice, the identity that had driven every major hit, all of it had walked out with Randy Bachman. Albums released in the post-Randy era saw dramatically reduced chart impact. Mercury Records eventually dropped them. The rise of punk and disco had already made the classic BTO sound feel like a relic, and without Randy driving the creative vision, there was nothing to reinvigorate it. In 1979, Bachman-Turner Overdrive officially disbanded. 6 years from formation to dissolution. From Takin Care of Business to the curtain closing. From #1 on the Billboard 200 to silence. The explosive rise and the stunning collapse happened so fast that it almost seemed impossible, except that it's the most common story in rock and roll. Success doesn't just bring rewards. It brings pressure and money and ego and the slow suffocation of whatever made the thing work in the first place. Randy formed a new band called Iron Horse in 1979, which found minor chart success but never approached what BTO had built. The others drifted. And across that distance, something started to harden between the men who had once stood on the same stage and called each other brothers. Literally. Through the 1980s, the BTO story entered a strange new chapter, one of partial reunions, fragmented lineups, and the persistent question of whether the band could ever really come back. Various reunion attempts surfaced. Sometimes Randy was involved. Sometimes he wasn't. Fred Turner, who had been the co-lead vocalist and one of the band's most essential voices, intermittently reconnected with different configurations of former members. Robbie Bachman, the drummer, appeared in reunion versions of the act. There were shows. There were tours. There was the persistent commercial pull of songs that had never stopped being played on classic rock radio. For a moment in the mid-1980s, it looked like something might genuinely reconstitute. Randy and Fred Turner reconnected. There was music. There was the suggestion of a real second chapter. But the story wasn't over. Not by a long way. Because lurking beneath every reunion conversation, every tentative step back toward shared stages, was the question that had never been answered cleanly. Who actually owned Bachman-Turner Overdrive? This is where the story takes its most bitter turn. Lawsuits arose over the band name. Members disputed royalty payments. Accusations flew about unauthorized touring. Who had the right to perform as BTO? Who was trading on a shared legacy without the other's consent? Who was essentially using a name that didn't belong to them alone? The Bachman name itself became a legal battleground. Randy was performing BTO songs in solo shows, which was one thing. But the question of who could legally tour as BTO was something courts had to sort out, and court battles dragged on into the 2000s. Decades. 2 decades of legal conflict over the bones of a band that had burned brightest for roughly 3 years. Business management issues fueled the resentment. The sense that someone had taken more than their share, controlled more than they should have, benefited while others didn't. These are the stories that families tell each other across kitchen tables and eventually across courtrooms. Some members accused others of unauthorized touring. Counter-accusations followed. The brother conflict that had been a private wound became a matter of public record. The working-class band that had projected solidarity and straightforwardness ended up mired in exactly the kind of business complexity they'd always seemed to reject. Meanwhile, Takin Care of Business kept playing in arenas. You Ain't Seen Nothing Yet kept appearing in commercials. The songs were everywhere, still earning, still resonating, while the men who made them couldn't share a room. There's something deeply ironic about a band called Bachman-Turner Overdrive running so hot for so long that they burned out the engine entirely. In 2003, Bachman-Turner Overdrive was inducted into the Canadian Music Hall of Fame. The recognition was deserved and long overdue. Their impact on Canadian rock, on 1970s hard rock broadly, on the sound of AM and FM radio during their commercial peak, it was real and it was lasting. But even recognition couldn't fully dissolve what had fractured. The tensions, the lawsuits, the accusations, they persisted even as the cultural world celebrated what the band had been. Randy Bachman continued performing as a solo artist, carrying the weight and the glory of that legacy with him everywhere he went. Fred Turner made appearances across the years. And in 2023, Robbie Bachman, the drummer, the brother, the heartbeat of the original lineup, passed away. Another door closed permanently. Another chance at any kind of final resolution gone. The catalog continues to generate royalties. The music streams. Takin Care of Business plays at sporting events every weekend somewhere in North America. The songs outlived the band, outlived the legal battles, and may outlive everything else. But here's the thing about Bachman-Turner Overdrive that sticks with you after you know the full story. They didn't fail because they weren't talented. They didn't fail because the music wasn't good. They rose faster than almost any Canadian act of their era, sold 20 million records, reached #1 on both sides of the border, and created songs so durable they became permanent fixtures of popular culture. They fell because success is a pressure test, and not everything that looks solid actually is. The band that called itself Bachman-Turner Overdrive, that name promising relentless forward motion, momentum, power, eventually ran at such intensity that it tore itself apart. The very energy that made them great was the same energy that made the fractures deepen and the wounds become permanent. Brotherhood built it. Brotherhood broke it. And the songs remain, playing on, indifferent to all of it, as loud and alive as they ever were. Did you ever see BTO live? Were you one of the millions who wore out a copy of Not Fragile? Or maybe you grew up hearing Takin Care of Business without ever knowing the story behind it. The family, the lawsuits, the years of silence between brothers. Drop your thoughts below. What part of this story hit you hardest? And if you want more stories of bands that rose like rockets and burned just as fast, hit subscribe, because there are plenty more where this came from.